There are soldiers who fight with rifles. There are soldiers who fight with tanks. There are soldiers who fight with bombers and artillery and the full crushing weight of industrial warfare. And then there were 1,100 men who fought with rubber, with loudspeakers, with paint, with acting, with elaborate, audacious, magnificent deception. Men who impersonated entire armies, who conjured phantom divisions out of inflatable tanks and recorded sound effects and fake radio traffic, who bluffed and performed and deceived their way across Western Europe, while real soldiers bled and died around them. They were called the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. History knows them as the Ghost Army, and for 50 years after the war ended, nobody knew they existed. This is not a story about firepower. This is a story about imagination, about what happens when the United States Army recruits its soldiers from art schools and theater departments and advertising agencies and jazz clubs, gives them a classified mission, tells them to pretend to be someone else, and sets them loose on Nazi-occupied Europe. It is one of the strangest, most creative, most genuinely bizarre military operations of the Second World War. And it worked. Every single time, it worked. To understand the Ghost Army, you have to understand the problem they were created to solve. By 1943, the Allied war effort had achieved something remarkable. They had built, trained, and equipped the largest military force in American history. Millions of men, thousands of tanks, fleets of aircraft. The industrial output of the United States, fully mobilized, was producing weapons and vehicles and supplies at a rate that no other nation on earth could match. The question was not whether America could field an army. The question was whether that army could deceive the Germans about where and how it would fight. Deception in warfare is as old as warfare itself. Every general who ever lived has understood that what the enemy believes about you matters as much as what you actually are. Sun Tzu wrote about it. Napoleon practiced it. But the Second World War elevated military deception to an entirely new level of sophistication, and the British in particular, who had been in the war since 1939 and had been fighting defensively and creatively since Dunkirk, had developed deception techniques of extraordinary complexity. The double-cross system, through which British intelligence ran almost every German spy in Britain as a double agent, was one of the most successful intelligence operations in history. The deceptions surrounding D-Day, Operation Fortitude, the creation of a fictional army group commanded by General Patton to make the Germans believe the main Allied landing would come at Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy, were masterpieces of coordinated strategic deception. The Americans learned from the British, and in the planning for the liberation of Europe, American military planners began thinking about how to create a unit specifically designed for tactical deception. The kind of battlefield deception that could make a German commander think he faced a full armored division when he actually faced a battalion, or that could make him think American forces were concentrated on his left when they were actually crossing the river on his right. The answer they came up with was the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. The recruitment was unlike anything in the history of the American military. The unit needed men who could paint, men who could act, men who understood visual design and camouflage and the psychology of perception, men who could operate sound equipment, men who could forge documents and design insignia and create the visual appearance of a military unit that did not actually exist. They needed, in short, artists. They went to the art schools. They went to the design schools. They recruited from the Art Students League of New York. They recruited from the Pratt Institute. They recruited from theater companies and advertising agencies. They recruited jazz musicians and portrait painters and illustrators and graphic designers and men who in civilian life made their livings by making things look like other things, or by making people feel things that weren't real, or by constructing convincing fictions for paying audiences. Among the men who served in the Ghost Army were Ellsworth Kelly, who would become one of the most celebrated abstract painters of the 20th century. Bill Blass, who would become one of the most famous fashion designers in America. Arthur Singer, who would become a renowned wildlife illustrator. Pianist Arthur Cohn. Photographer Art Kane. Men who, in the years after the war, would fill the galleries and fashion houses and concert halls and advertising agencies of America with work shaped, consciously or unconsciously, by what they had seen and done in Europe between 1944 and 1945. They were, as one veteran later put it, the most talented group of people ever to be paid $30 a month by the United States Army. Training took place in the United States, then in Britain after they crossed the Atlantic in May 1944, just weeks before D-Day. They were organized into 4 distinct sections, each responsible for a different component of the deception operation. The sonic deception section operated half-track vehicles mounted with enormous speakers capable of producing sound at levels that could be heard 15 miles away. The recorded sounds of tanks moving, of troops marching, of bridge-building equipment, of artillery being repositioned, of the specific mechanical signatures of particular military units. The visual deception section operated the inflatable tanks, trucks, artillery pieces, and aircraft, enormous rubber replicas that from a distance were indistinguishable from the real thing, that could be inflated by a small team in hours and deflated and packed into a truck when the operation was complete. The radio deception section operated a network of transmitters that simulated the radio traffic of entire military units, fake message traffic, fake call signs, fake operational chatter that German signals intelligence would intercept and use to build a false picture of American dispositions. And the camouflage section was responsible for the physical management of the deception, marking roads with the insignia of whatever unit they were impersonating, wearing that unit's shoulder patches, driving into towns with the unit's markings on their vehicles, talking to civilians and local officials as if they were that unit. That last element, the personal, human performance element of the deception, was where the theatrical talent of the unit came into its own. The Ghost Army soldiers were not just operating equipment, they were acting. They were playing roles in an improvised theater with an audience of German intelligence analysts and French civilians and their own fellow Allied soldiers, none of whom could know the truth. They walked into bars in French towns wearing the patches of divisions that were actually 50 miles away. They talked loudly about their unit's operations in places where German informants might be listening. They drove conspicuously through intersections where they knew German observation was likely, with the right markings, in the right vehicles, in the right numbers to suggest the presence of a much larger force. It was method acting in a war zone, with the additional detail that if the method failed, if the deception was seen through, if the Germans realized that the armored division blocking their route was actually 1,100 artists and musicians with rubber tanks, real American soldiers would die to cover the failure. The Ghost Army arrived in France in mid-June 1944, just days after D-Day. Their first operations began almost immediately. The learning curve was steep. The first deceptions were imperfect. The inflatable tanks, seen from close range or in certain lighting conditions, did not look entirely convincing. The sonic deception equipment was extraordinarily effective at distance, but had limitations. The radio deceptions required constant, exhausting maintenance, keeping multiple fake unit identities alive simultaneously with the right patterns of traffic, the right timing, the right mix of routine and operational messages required round-the-clock operation by teams who were also doing everything else. They learned fast. They got better fast. Over the course of the Western European campaign, the Ghost Army executed approximately 21 distinct deception operations. They impersonated at least 25 different real military units, armored divisions, infantry divisions, artillery brigades, corps headquarters. They operated from the bocage country of Normandy to the banks of the Rhine, across the battlefields of France and Luxembourg and Belgium and Germany. They were in the Ardennes when the Germans launched their last great offensive in December 1944, the Battle of the Bulge. They were at the Rhine crossing in March 1945, executing what would be their most important and most complex deception of the entire war. In Normandy, in the summer of 1944, they impersonated the 2nd Armored Division to draw German attention away from a planned American advance. In Luxembourg in September, they impersonated the 6th Armored Division. In the Ardennes, as German panzer units poured through the Allied lines in the Battle of the Bulge, the Ghost Army performed improvisational deceptions that helped protect the flanks of units that were desperately thin on the ground. These were not careful, planned operations mounted at leisure from safe positions. These were field improvisations, mounted quickly, under fire, in the chaos of a battle that nobody on the Allied side had expected, and nobody was entirely sure how to stop. The men of the Ghost Army were not, in the conventional military sense, combat soldiers. They were not trained and equipped for sustained infantry fighting. They carried personal weapons, and they used them. There were casualties in the unit, men who died from artillery fire and mines and the general ambient lethality of a war zone. But their weapon was not firepower. Their weapon was the gap between what the Germans believed and what was actually true. Every hour that gap held, real American soldiers had freedom of movement, freedom to concentrate force, freedom to cross a river or turn a flank or prepare an attack without the Germans knowing where the blow was coming from. The question of how many lives the Ghost Army saved is unanswerable with precision. Deception, by its nature, works in the realm of the counterfactual. What would have happened if the Germans had known the truth, had concentrated their forces correctly, had struck at the real point of vulnerability rather than the false one? The post-war assessments suggested that the Ghost Army's operations may have saved tens of thousands of Allied lives. Some of the veterans believed the number was higher. What is certain is that every one of their 21 deception operations succeeded to a significant degree, and that in the mathematics of a war where information about enemy dispositions was worth thousands of soldiers, success of that consistency was extraordinary. The Rhine crossing of March 1945 was their masterpiece. By early 1945, the Allies were advancing toward Germany. The Rhine, the great river that had been the eastern boundary of the Roman Empire, that German mythology had invested with deep symbolic importance, that the Nazi regime had promised would never be crossed by an enemy, was the last major natural barrier between the Allied armies and the heart of Germany. Crossing the Rhine was going to be one of the most contested military operations of the Western campaign. General Omar Bradley and his staff needed the Germans to be looking in the wrong place when the crossing happened. They needed the German forces defending the Rhine to be concentrated against a threat that wasn't coming, so that the actual crossing could achieve surprise. They gave the Ghost Army a mission: make the Germans think the crossing was coming at a different point than the real one. The Ghost Army set up a full deception operation at a false crossing site miles away from where the actual crossing would occur. They deployed their inflatable tanks and trucks along the approaches to the false site. They ran their sonic equipment, broadcasting the sounds of bridging operations, the distinctive mechanical noise of pontoon bridge equipment being assembled, the sounds of heavy vehicles moving to a riverbank, the sounds of engineers at work. They ran radio traffic simulating the communications of the units that would supposedly make the crossing. They put their own men in the uniforms of the units they were impersonating and drove those men through the nearby towns where German intelligence had observation posts. The Germans fell for it. German artillery concentrated on the false crossing site. German armored reserves moved to positions to counterattack the crossing they believed was coming. And while the German attention and firepower were focused on the Ghost Army's fiction, The real American crossing went in at the actual site. The 30th and 79th Infantry Divisions crossed the Rhine on the night of March 25, 1945, with a speed and completeness of surprise that the operation's planners had hoped for but had not dared to count on. 1,500 years after Rome had defended the Rhine as the boundary of civilization, American infantry crossed it in rubber boats, and the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops helped them do it with inflatable tanks and a set of sound recordings and men in other men's uniforms standing on a riverbank 15 miles away. And then, with the crossing successful and the German defense of the Rhine broken and the war visibly in its final weeks, the Ghost Army was quietly stood down. Their records were classified. Their deceptions were sealed away in archives that would not be opened to the public for decades. The men were discharged. They went back to New York, to the art schools and advertising agencies and jazz clubs. Ellsworth Kelly went back to painting. Bill Blass went back to fashion. The others went back to whatever they had been doing before the Army found them and handed them inflatable tanks and told them to go fool the Germans. For years, they could not talk about it. The classification meant silence. They went to reunions, and they sat across from each other and shared the memories they could not share with anyone else. The improvised performances in French towns, the night operations with the sonic equipment, the moments when a deception almost unraveled, and they had held their breath and held their nerve and kept playing their roles until it held. They aged together in possession of a secret that was one of the genuinely extraordinary stories of the Second World War, known to almost no one. The declassification came gradually. By the 1990s, enough material had been released that historians and journalists could begin piecing the story together. A documentary film, The Ghost Army, directed by Rick Beyer, was broadcast on PBS in 2013 and brought the story to a wider audience for the first time. Some of the veterans were still alive, elderly men in their 90s, sharp-minded and articulate, with memories of France and Luxembourg and the Rhine that had not faded despite the decades. They gave their interviews with the particular quality of relief that comes from finally being able to say what you did and know that it matters. Bernie Bluestein, who served in the sonic section and later became a successful musician, described the operations as the most exciting and terrifying experiences of his life in the same breath. He described setting up the sonic equipment at night near German lines, playing the recordings of tank movements at enormous volume, knowing that if a German patrol investigated the source of the sound, they would find not a tank division, but a half-track and a few men with a turntable. The bravery required for that kind of operation is not the bravery of the charge. It is the quieter, more sustained bravery of the performance maintained under mortal pressure. The actor who cannot break character, because breaking character means people die. Harold Lehner, an artist who served in the visual deception section, kept sketching through the entire campaign. His sketchbooks, surviving in the archives, are one of the most remarkable documents of the European campaign. They show the France of 1944 and 1945 not as the France of official military photography, the landing craft, the generals, the liberation crowds, but as the France seen by a young artist with a pencil and a sketchbook, in the quiet moments between deceptions. A Norman farmhouse, a Luxembourg village street, a German prisoner's face, the Rhine at dawn. The war as it actually looked to the people who were in it, recorded by someone who had been specifically recruited because he knew how to see. The Ghost Army was eventually given formal congressional recognition in 2022, when President Biden signed the Ghost Army Congressional Gold Medal Act, awarding the unit the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest civilian honor in the United States. By that point, most of the veterans were gone. A handful remained to receive the recognition in person. The ceremony was held in Washington, and the surviving veterans, men in their late 90s and hundreds of years old in experience, if not in years, sat in the great room and received the medal for 1,100 men who had fought a war with rubber and sound and the oldest human technology of all, the ability to make someone believe something that wasn't true. What the Ghost Army understood, what made them effective, was something that professional soldiers sometimes resist understanding. That war is as much a psychological event as a physical one. That what a commander believes about the battlefield shapes his decisions more powerfully than what is actually on the battlefield. That the gap between perception and reality, exploited at the right moment by the right people, can be worth more than a division of infantry or a regiment of tanks. They were artists. They understood perception. They understood the gap between appearance and reality because that gap is the medium in which artists work, the canvas that is not actually a landscape, the notes that are not actually joy or sorrow, the words that are not actually the events they describe. They brought that understanding to a war, and they used it to save lives, to shorten the campaign, to cross the Rhine while the Germans were watching the wrong bank. The Ghost Army. 1,100 men with inflatable tanks and a set of sound recordings and the conviction that imagination, deployed with precision and courage, can change the outcome of a war. They were right.